See, this guy has a diseased mind. He says, he's been treated so unfairly. That's a part of his malignant narcissism. It's a part of his justification for doing the things that he does because he's been treated, so unfairly. Now, the credulous, the easily led, they'll buy this right away. They'll eat this up because many of them actually have been treated unfairly. But Donald Trump hasn't. And that distinction is absolutely crucial if you're going to understand what's happening in the United States today. Because the story is not merely Donald Trump, but what Donald Trump represents.
This is Politics by Jake. Most commentators merely report events. Jake decodes and reveals the hidden systems beneath the headlines. He exposes the enduring, sometimes generational patterns that govern history, politics, economics, and human behavior. Jake names the unnamed. He brings into focus the things that we're hiding, sometimes even in plain sight. And now, here's Jake.
All right. Thank you very much. That's our announcer. This is Politics by Jake. I'm Jake. Welcome to the show. As I always say at the beginning of the show, but it bears repeating, welcome to 2026. Welcome to the fight. We know we've got new listeners, some subscribers and viewers all the time. That's great. We love it. We read your comments. We respond to some of them. And the show is guided, actually, by some of your comments. So that's terrific. We've got a huge existential fight coming up. We're closing in on about 100 days to one of the most consequential elections. And I say consequential, but I also say existential because it is existential, because it decides whether the United States is going to go on as a democracy. And when I say that, I don't mean the ancient Greek democracy. The ancient Greek word for democratic rule was like rule by the mob. It's kind of like rule by the mob. That's not what democracy has come to mean. It's evolved, but it's rule by the people. The people is distinguished from the mob, and I think that's a very defendable notion. So. But it's a democratic republic because our republic is not, it's not a democracy. People say, well, it's a democracy. And I say, no, it's not a democracy. People say it's a republic. And I say, no, sorry, it's not a republic. It's a hybrid. It's a democratic republic. And it has elements of both democracy and a traditional republicanism. And it also contains oligarchic elements. I don't know if we'll get into that show today, but we will get into it. The oligarchy has always been there. Oligarchs have always been throughout all generations of time and throughout all eternity. They have always been here. They're always going to continue to be here. And so the government that was created by the founders was created with that in mind. The oligarchic element is countenanced in the Senate, for example. That tends to be that kind of a thing. Honestly, the oligarchic element also really kind of exists in the Supreme Court. So there are two things. And then you have the executive, and the executive is elected by the people, but also by the electoral vote. So it's a combination of the people and the oligarchy, the ordinary people and the oligarchy. So you have that. And then you have the House, which is supposed to be the people. And that's supposed to be true democratic rule. Of course, you have recently, and I call into the show or check with me in the comments because I post these shows on Rumble and YouTube. Check with me on this. I think it was Darrell Issa who recently said that he was most, I don't know if he was bragging or if he was just making a statement of fact, but he basically just said that he was richer than anyone in the Senate. That's not the way it should be. Those are not the people we should have in the House. Darrell Issa should run for the Senate if that's the case and leave that to the common people, because that constitutes an oligarchic capture, and that's something that we're actually going to be talking about right now. So anyway, welcome to the show, and let's go on with what we were talking about. And actually, that's kind of a good segue, because I would say that America is, not simply under attack. I know it's very dramatic and people like to say America is under attack. It's being captured, and it's being captured by oligarchs. It's being captured by billionaires. It's being captured by corporate interests, by technologarchs. It's being captured by people who believe that government exists to enrich themselves rather than to protect everybody's rights. And Donald Trump, he's just the most visible instrument through which much of this is being accomplished. And everything I'm going to tell you today, it flows from that proposition. Donald Trump took what is essentially, this cracks me up. He took what is essentially a rape case. It's basically a rape case. He took it all the way to Supreme Court because he didn't want to pay the money. Okay. And do you know what the Supreme Court just did about a week and a half or so ago? Do you know what they did? They told him to go pound sand. They told him, pay up, you sleazy, no good, so-and-so. Now think about that. That's they didn't say, you no good, sleazy, so-and-so, but they did tell him to pay up, and they did kind of tell him to pound sand. Now, think about that. That's 6-3. That's a supermajority. Those are justices who, in large measure, okay, they owe their appointments to Donald Trump. And yet they told him to go pound sand anyway. He wasn't being treated unfairly. He undoubtedly will say that in his heart of hearts and in his mind of minds, and to everybody, including his secretary, who prints out things that he will like to see, and so gives him a diluted and a perverted view. I think her name is April Harper. I'm going to start talking about her a little bit more, but who is basically around him all the time and just feeds him this stuff. She is a typical palace courtier that we talk about from time to time. He was being treated according to law. That's what Donald Trump was being treated according to. And he then wanted to violate the 14th Amendment, the law of the soil, the use solely. And I'm going to basically spell this because the subtitle app doesn't get this. So it's use solely. The subtitle app spells it U-S-E, like use, and then solely, like S-O-L-Y, or sometimes S-O-L-E-Y. It's use, it's Latin. It's use, I-U-S. And then the second word is solely, S-O-L-I. The use solely. That's the law of the soil. And that's part of what Abraham Lincoln promised at Gettysburg when he spoke of a new birth of freedom. He promised a new birth of freedom. That's what the Civil War really was all about. That's what tens of thousands of Union soldiers died for. And among them, more than 200,000 African Americans. These people earned their citizenship. Although philosophically speaking, they should never have had to earn it at all. And do you know why? Because it's a well-known principle. I mean, if you don't believe me, like, go and read Blackstone's commentaries, okay? Rights precede government. In fact, you may find it under that exact subheading. I'm going from memory here, but back in my law school days, I read this: rights precede government. In other words, we do not possess our rights because the United States government graciously decided, that they were going to give it to us. Rights are inalienable. They existed before we were born. They exist upon our being born. And they exist thereafter throughout our lives. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether the government recognizes them. They exist. They cannot be removed. They cannot be modified. They cannot be compromised. And they cannot be taken away. Although, certainly people like Donald Trump, Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, and the billionaires who Jamie Dimon on their behalf declared at Davos, Switzerland, that they were, in words to the effect, all in for Trump in 2024, would very much like to do exactly that. These billionaires who cleave to doctrines like eugenics, long disproven, doctrines embraced by the Nazis, for God's sakes. And so far as I can tell, doctrines whose early development included the United States. Somebody may want to check every historical detail there, but I know this much: William Harvey Kellogg, yes, that's right, the cornflakes guy. You eat his cereal very often in the morning, except for those of you who eat Post Toasties. I prefer the Kellogg's cornflakes, but we're not going to quibble about that here on Politics by Jake. But yeah, the cornflakes guy, Kellogg guy, believed these ideas. And he actually established a sanitarian, which, among other things, reflected them. So let's go back to the African Americans. Did they really have to earn the rights? No. They were free. And of course, you have the Dred Scott decision, which I don't know if I'm going to talk about, but if I miss it, I'll talk about it. They were free all along. Dred Scott's decision said that African Americans or slaves could never have a right. Never. But they were free all along. Government imposed chattel slavery upon them. Government forced them to fight for rights that already belonged to them. And guess what? They didn't have to, but they earned them anyway because of the aforementioned Dred Scott decision. You could very much argue that the Civil War, and yes, this is a continuation of a few days ago when we had the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the United States. We're going to be talking about those things probably throughout the month. They are worthy of discussion anytime, but no more so than any other time than on July 4th or in July, and especially at the quarter decennial, the quarter 1,000-year mark. You could argue that the Civil War, winning it, would have been vastly more difficult without those 200,000 African American soldiers. Fortunately, we had them. Now, watch what happens next, will you? Donald Trump wasn't merely challenging a legal doctrine. He was attacking the crowning achievement of American civilization, the 14th Amendment, the new birth of freedom, birthright citizenship. We just had the case about that. The law of the soil. Now ask yourself another question, okay? Who is really behind this? Donald Trump? Certainly. certainly Donald Trump, but not only Donald Trump. The same billionaires, the same palace courtiers, the same oligarchic interests, the same people who metaphorically hold Donald Trump's coat while he does these things, because there are more people behind this than Donald Trump. And do you honestly think that Jamie Dimon and those other billionaires didn't see him coming down the road from a long distance, didn't know exactly who Donald Trump was, didn't know what it was that they were buying when they contributed to his campaign? Of course they did. Of course they did. They knew he longed to be one of them. See, this is where I differ from most commentators. They knew he longed to be one of them. They knew he was a poor little rich boy. They knew he could be used, and they are using him. And they knew that through him, they could accomplish something that they have wanted for a very long time. The corporate and oligarchic capture of the United States. And everything that you're seeing now points in that direction. Everything. And may I say, they are proceeding at pace. They are moving as fast as they possibly can. Now, don't lose the thread, okay? Everything that we've discussed leads to this. Trump is selling the office to the highest bidder because this is his mentality. He thinks this is normal. And he knows that the other billionaires, the other oligarchs, the other technologarchs, the other corporate interests, the other people who swim in the same waters that he does, they have exactly the same mentality. The difference is they usually work silently. They resent very much a free press. In fact, they hate that kind of freedom because a genuinely free press points out their misdeeds. It points out their greed. It points out their maladroitness. It points out their incompetence. And that's exactly what they don't want. Now, this is difficult for ordinary Americans to believe. We've all been raised on the ideals of the Republic. We've been raised to believe that whatever our disagreements are, we're all Americans. We've been raised to believe that everybody ultimately wants what's best for the country. But there are people who have already descended to another level of thinking. These are people who already inhabit that level of thought. Trump is simply their poster boy. That's what he is. Jamie Dimon said it himself. We're all in for Trump. So those of you, my right-wing friends and my Christian friends and my MAGA friends, take a lesson, will you? This is the thing. These people are out there, and they are proceeding, as I said earlier, apace to capture America, to reshape it into something ugly, something deformed, some bastardized, misshapen form of what America was intended to be. So take the lesson, will you? Or if you cannot yet take the lesson, then at least leave open a small place in your mind that what Jake is saying, might be true. Then do your own research, do your own thinking, because that's the duty of every American citizen. This country gave you citizenship. The least we can do is educate ourselves sufficiently to deserve it. Here's another example. We're seeing ICE out there, the modern Gestapo. Yes, I call them the modern Gestapo. Actually, I was commenting to somebody the other day, and I said, this is just common thuggery. These guys look like the henchmen, from the movies, The Dark Knight or The Joker. They look just like that. They're just thugs. They don't even have the decency to wear proper kit. They're like the Gestapo in really bad uniforms. Yeah. They're arresting, I'll probably do a segment on them too. They're arresting thousands of people. One report I discussed last week put the figure at approximately 10,000. That's a lot of people. And as I've reported before on this program, when Pam Bondi was Attorney General, she was caught with Trump on an open microphone. Neither she or Donald Trump believed they were being overheard, I think. And Trump was saying, and there was an urgency. I witnessed it. I watched it. There was an urgency in his voice. He said, we have to go after my enemies. And he said there wasn't enough time. We're running out of time. That's what he said. Now, think about that. We know Donald Trump considers his enemies. We know that Stephen Miller has long been accused by critics of promoting white nationalist ideas. We know Donald Trump is a man whose family business was sued for racial discrimination in housing, 1973. His dad was sued, Fred Trump. The guy who was reported by the New York Times in 1927 of getting in a fight at a Ku Klux Klan march that was going through New York City. And unfortunately, in those days, those things existed. 3 guesses whose side he was on, who he was defending. And the first 2 don't count. Donald Trump has himself repeatedly demonstrated attitude towards race that we should all find deeply troubling. Fred Trump routinely, his dad again, routinely denied access to properties on a racial basis. And like I said, the federal government sued, they won, they had to pay. I think this goes a long way to explaining Donald Trump's mentality, that he's being treated so unfairly, because this is a man for whom money is everything. This is a man who vents his spleen through power. Now, whether you disagree with every aspect of my analysis or not, here's the part that you absolutely need to understand. These ICE officers, many of them masked, some of them are really, they're buffoons. They're just churls. They're common thugs. Many of them hooded. They're making mistakes. They're making serious mistakes. They're being sued. They're trying to arrest African Americans who turn out to be police officers. In one recent case, a police captain. And they also tried to arrest a judge, but that was a white guy. And they came out to his farm, and there was a Lamborghini parked there, and they said that was probable cause for them to believe that a crime was being committed, so that they didn't need to act with a warrant. And the guy was a judge. Millions of taxpayer dollars are being paid. You and me, we're paying it because of these errors. Keep this in mind. This doesn't mitigate their conduct, because these guys are idealists. These guys are jonesing for this kind of activity. It's what they have longed to do. Unrighteous dominion and compulsion. The unrighteous pursuit of power to lord it over other people. They're too ideologically committed. They're too convinced by their own righteousness. They're operating out of prejudices that have been cultivated silently for years through propaganda. Remember what I asked in a clip? Those of you who check, I have clips on social media most days, and I know a lot of you go there. Remember what I asked several weeks ago? Do some things never go away? I was talking about racism, because racism seems to be that evil gift that keeps on giving. It persists. It simply refuses to die. And you're seeing it. Again, not only is it morally wrong, but it's expensive. ICE is costing us money. The taxpayers ultimately pay these judgments. The taxpayers ultimately pay for the incompetence. The taxpayers ultimately pay for the abuse of power. So don't tell me this doesn't affect you. It does. It affects every single American who pays taxes. And that's Politics by Jake.
More of Politics by Jake after this.
And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable, and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake.
And now, Politics by Jake continues.
Hi, we're back. Now, I want to ask you a question that at first hearing is probably going to sound, outrageous. Is Donald Trump actually following Adolf Hitler's most successful political playbook? Now, before I go one word further, I already know that some of you are thinking, some of you have listened to this program for years, you're probably saying to yourselves, oh my God, here he goes again. Jake's about to tell us that Trump is Hitler. He's doing that again. No. Well, not exactly. So before you all run screaming from the room or desperately trying to pry the earbuds out of your ears before I can finish the sentence, just relax, okay? Stay with me for a few minutes because I promise you I'm actually going somewhere with this. And I think by the time that we're done, whether you agree with me or not, you'll at least understand why I'm asking this particular question. So give some space in your mind to what I'm about to propose, okay? So here we go. Yes, this is ultimately about Donald Trump, but I'm not going to start with Donald Trump. I don't even want to start with Adolf Hitler, which probably is a switch for you and might blow your mind. But what I want to do is start with something that happened in November of 1918 that almost nobody knows about. There was this journalist, an American journalist by the name of George Seldes, and he was what was known at the time as a muckraker. Now, when I call George Seldes a muckraker, I don't mean that as an insult. A muckraker was an investigative reporter. In those days, there was already a well-established tradition of investigative journalism, digging into corruption, exposing powerful interests, publishing facts that powerful people wished had remained hidden. That was called muckraking because you were down in the dirt, you see. And George Seldes, He was one of the very best of them. Now, watch what happens next. Immediately following the armistice in November of 1918, which it wasn't the end of the war, but it was the end of the war was like the Treaty of Paris at Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors, So Seldes had the opportunity to interview the commander of the defeated German army, and that was Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. Now, think about that for just a moment. This is quite a plum for any reporter. The war had just ended. Germany had lost, okay? The Kaiser had abdicated, fled the country, probably already in the Netherlands by this time. That's where he wound up anyway. By the time, this interview takes place, Europe had been turned upside down, and Seldes asks Hindenburg, and remember who he's talking to. This is the senior commander of the German army. And he asks him the obvious question: who won the war? And it's about, the most obvious question you could ask the man who had just commanded the defeated German army. Now, remember, everybody at the time was trying to take credit. Some said it was the British, some said it was the French, others emphasized that it was the Italians in the South, still others said the Belgians. Everybody had a theory about this. But Hindenburg's answer stunned Seldes. According to Seldes, Hindenburg began by saying something like this: I am a soldier. I speak as a soldier, not as a politician. And according to George Seldes, Hindenburg answered this way: I will reply with the same frankness. The American infantry in the Argonne, in the Meuse, it's pronounced Meuse, it's M-E-U-S-E, but it's pronounced Meuse. In the Meuse, Argonne, won the war. And he paused, and then he continued, I say this as a soldier, and soldiers will understand. I must confess that Germany could not have won the war after 1917. We might have won some land, but after the world failure, the British blockade reached its greatest effectiveness in 1970. I really must say that the British blockade and the American blow in the Argonne of 1918, those things are the things that decided the war for the Allies. Then Hindenburg added something that to me is every bit as important. He said that without the American troops, despite the blockade, Germany might still have achieved what he called a peace without victory, a negotiated stalemate. Now stop right there, okay? Because this is the commander of the German army speaking, not as a politician. He said so, not as a politician, but as a soldier. Now let me restate that. In plain English, what Hindenburg was saying was this: Germany had been beaten militarily. The British naval blockade was strangling the country, and it was. The world food harvests had failed. The arrival of fresh American forces, particularly during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, destroyed Germany's last realistic hope of forcing a negotiated stalemate. In other words, Germany could not win. Think about that. The senior commander of the German army is telling an American reporter that Germany was militarily defeated. Not politically defeated, not betrayed, militarily defeated. Let me say it again. Militarily defeated. And I want to emphasize something else here as well. We are not speculating. We are not interpolating. We are not conjecturing. We are not trying to read motives into history here. We have George Seldes's published account of what Hindenburg told him. That is the foundation upon which I'm building this argument. Now, hold on to that thought, because if Hindenburg is saying this to George Seldes, a reporter whom he knows is going to publish his words, and he tells him, I am speaking as a soldier, not as a politician, and later says something very different publicly, then I think we have to ask ourselves a very important question. What changed? Because what happened next became one of the most consequential political myths of the 20th century. Now, if that's where the story ended, it would simply be one of those, fascinating little footnotes of history, an obscure interview, a remarkable admission, and then history moves on. But that's not what happened. In fact, that's where the story really begins, because sometime later, something changed. The very same Paul von Hindenburg, who in 1918 had told George Seldes, I speak as a soldier, not as a politician, would later appear before the German Parliamentary Committee established to investigate Germany's defeat in 1919. I say again, 1919, okay? And now he wasn't speaking merely as a soldier, was he, anymore? He was speaking in the middle of one of the greatest political crises Germany had ever experienced. The Kaiser was gone. The empire had collapsed. The economy was in ruins. Millions of Germans wanted an answer to one simple question. How could this have happened? And history teaches us that whenever people desperately want an explanation, someone is usually willing to provide one. So remember what Hindenburg already said. He had said Germany could not have won the war after 1917. He said the British blockade was strangling Germany. He said the American offensive in the Meuse-Argonne had broken Germany's last realistic hope of forcing a stalemate. Those were military explanations. Those were the explanations of a soldier, frank, blunt, like speaking to soldiers, like ordinary men in ordinary language. But now the explanation began to change. Instead of asking whether Germany had been defeated militarily, people began asking whether Germany had been betrayed politically. And that is where one of the most consequential political myths in human history, in modern history, I should say, was born. The Germans gave it a name, the Dolchstoßlegende. And that means the stab in the back legend, or the stab in the back story. Now, let me stop just for a moment, because the German can sound intimidating. It really isn't. Dolch means dagger. Stoß means thrust or stab. Legende means legend or story. Quite literally, the dagger stab legend, or as we usually say in English, the stab in the back myth. And the idea was breathtakingly simple. Germany had not lost. Germany had been betrayed, not by the army, not by the generals, but by the politicians, by civilians, by socialists. That's always a good one. By communists. So there's another good one. Oh, by Jews. Oh, there's a good one. That's always good. Trot that one out. That's always good. By people at home who supposedly lacked the courage, according to this, idea, to support the soldiers fighting at the front. Now, whether you believe that or not isn't really the point. The point is this: it was completely different, a completely different explanation from the one Hindenburg had given to George Seldes. Not just a little different, it was entirely different. And that raises what I think is the central question. What happened? How does the man who tells a German reporter an American reporter in 1918 that Germany was military defeated, later lend its prestige to the idea that Germany was betrayed from within? What changed? Did the facts change, or did the politics? Because I think, the answer to that question is one of the keys to understanding not only Adolf Hitler, but perhaps a great deal of modern politics as well. Now we come to Adolf Hitler. And this is where people often misunderstand Hitler. Hitler did not invent the stab in the back myth. He inherited it. It was already there. It had already been planted. It had already begun taking root in the minds of millions of Germans who desperately wanted an explanation for the greatest catastrophe of their nation had ever experienced. Here's the key. Hitler simply recognized something that every successful politician eventually learns. People would much rather believe they were betrayed than that they were defeated. Now, think about that for a moment. Defeat requires self-examination. Betrayal, all that requires is an enemy. If I have been defeated, I have to ask what I did wrong. If I have been betrayed, I don't have to change at all. I merely have to find a traitor. And Hitler understood that better than anyone. So what did he do? He repeated it over and over and over again. Germany had not lost. Germany had been betrayed. The politicians betrayed us. The socialists betrayed us. The communists betrayed us. The Jews betrayed us. The so-called November criminals betrayed us. The sanitation workers betrayed us. The bricklayers betrayed us. The coffee shop attendants betrayed us. Are you getting the idea here? Do you see what's happening? Do you see what Hitler is doing? Now, let me add, okay, at this point, I'm exaggerating a little for effect to emphasize how ridiculous and how grasping and how far-reaching Hitler's argument really was. But the idea was to make the military defeat itself almost secondary. The real objective was something else. The objective was to create a permanent sense of grievance, a permanent sense that someone inside the nation had stolen something from you. Because that is Germans. Because once people accept that story, they stop asking whether it's true. They begin asking who did it. And once that politician succeeds in convincing people that invisible enemies inside their own country are responsible for all their suffering, he has acquired something extraordinarily valuable. He has acquired a political weapon. Now, let me be very careful here. I'm not saying every politician who speaks about enemies within is Adolf Hitler. History is never that simple. What I am saying, however, is that Hitler demonstrated just how powerful this political technique can become. Take a genuine national disappointment, reinterpret it as an act of internal betrayal. Identify enemies within. Then promise that only you can save the nation from them. You get it? That is a remarkably effective political formula. And history shows us it can also be an extraordinarily dangerous one. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because I want to ask another question. One that I think is entirely fair. One that I think every thoughtful citizen ought to consider. Did this political technique disappear with Adolf Hitler, or has it appeared again in modern American politics? Now let's come back to Donald Trump. We're finally at Donald Trump. And here's something some of you may already know. Others, you may not have heard this before. Years ago, Ivana Trump, the former wife of Donald Trump, reported, the one that's buried in the golf course now, and who knows what else is buried there with her. The wife of Donald Trump reported that Donald Trump kept a book, and it was a book of Hitler's speeches, and he kept it beside his bed. Now, I don't know whether he read every speech. I don't know which speeches he read. I don't know what lessons, if any, he drew from them, and neither do you. Not for sure, anyway. But I think one inference is entirely reasonable. If a man keeps a book of Hitler's speeches at his bedside, it is probably because he intends to read them. I think so. And if he reads them, it's probably because he hopes to learn something from them. Now, ask yourself, especially knowing Donald Trump as you do, What might that have been? Well, I don't think it was military strategy. I don't think Donald Trump had any intention of invading Poland. I think it was something much more practical because Hitler, whatever else might be said about him, understood how to obtain and consolidate political power. He understood propaganda. He understood repetition. He understood grievance. He understood division. Now, where did he learn all of that? Well, perhaps one cue is that after the First World War, he worked for German military intelligence. And yes, I realize that phrase, German military intelligence, it almost sounds like an oxymoron, some stand-up comedian's bad joke. But bear with me, okay? Whether he learned these techniques there or someone else, by the time he entered politics, he clearly understood how political movements are built. In fact, there is evidence that one of his assignments was to be seated in political crowds and meetings on behalf of the German army, to observe, to report back, to gauge the strength of those emerging political movements. There's even a well-known photograph of Hitler standing in such a crowd before he himself became a public political figure. Now, I can't tell you exactly what lessons he drew from those experiences, and neither can anybody else. But I can tell you this. By the time Adolf Hitler had entered politics, he had become extraordinarily adept at understanding crowds, grievance, propaganda, repetition, and the mechanics of acquiring political power. And he understood the extraordinary political power that comes from persuading millions of people that their greatest enemies are not foreign armies, but their fellow citizens. Now think about that. Analytically, how often have we heard the phrase, the enemy within? How often have we heard that America has been betrayed? How often have we heard that the real danger isn't merely foreign adversaries, but Americans themselves? You know, the deep state, the fake news, disloyal Republicans, radical Democrats, the bureaucracy, the judges, the universities, the election officials, the immigrants. Now stop right there. Am I saying those people are identical to Hitler's enemies? No. That's not my argument. My argument is something quite different. It is that the political technique is strikingly similar. The appeal is not merely to disagreement. It is an appeal to betrayal. It says that the nation has not simply encountered problems, it has been sabotaged from within. This political technique is far older than Hitler. The ancient Romans knew it. They even had a proverb for it. Divide et impera. Divide and conquer. Keep the people divided. Keep them fighting one another, and they won't unite against you. Hitler did not invent that technique, but judging from what happened, you could reasonably say that he applied it extraordinarily well. And when I learned that Donald Trump reportedly kept Hitler's speeches by his bedside, I could not help asking myself a very simple question. And at this point, I'd ask you to stop also and consider these very same questions. Is it really unreasonable to think that he studied them? I don't think so. In fact, I think it's far more problematic to argue that he didn't. See, Ivana Trump wasn't describing a book sitting on a shelf somewhere. She wasn't describing a book gathering dust at some library in the Trump mansion. She was describing a book that, according to her, sat on Donald Trump's nightstand. Now, I mean, I think that the argument could quite reasonably be made that the very last thing he looked at before he went to bed at night, now, that's something. The very last thing that he looked at before he went to bed at night. That's something. At least to me, that's something. And then comes the next question. If he studied them, is it unreasonable to think that he learned something from them? I think that those are entirely fair questions. Now, you may answer them differently than I do, but I mean, I think they deserve to be asked, because I don't believe history merely tells us what happened. History teaches us how power works. And if we fail to recognize the techniques of history when they reappear, then history has really very little to teach us at all. So let's go back, shall we, to the question which we began with. Is Donald Trump Adolf Hitler? No. History doesn't repeat itself that neatly. And I don't think it's intellectually honest to argue that it does. But is Donald Trump employing one of Adolf Hitler's most successful political techniques? I think that argument can quite reasonably be made that he is. Now, notice what we've done. We didn't begin with Donald Trump. We didn't even begin with Adolf Hitler. We began with history. Now, picture this, okay? The First World War has just ended. Germany is in ruins. Much of Germany has been devastated by 4 years of war. It's so bad. It's so bad that the Kaiser himself, that's the supreme political leader, has abdicated. Not only has he abdicated, he's fled. He has fled the country. The German Empire is collapsing. The soldiers are starving. The citizenry's starving too. The British blockade has brought Germany to the brink. The war is over. Germany has lost. And into that moment walks George Seldes, well-known, well-connected American reporter, not some mere flunky, not some staffer, not some gopher. And he sits down with the commander of the German army himself. And Hindenburg absolutely, positively knows that whatever he says is going to be reported all over the world. He knows full well that his words will be read, they'll be debated, they'll be analyzed, and they will be remembered. And he tells George Seldes that Germany had been militarily defeated by the Americans in the Meuse-Argonne. Not betrayed, militarily defeated. Now, that matters, because that isn't something Hindenburg said years later. That isn't hindsight. That isn't revisionist history. That isn't political spin. That is the commander of the German army speaking, as he said in his own words, as a soldier at the very moment Germany had fallen. And then something changes. The story changes. Military defeat slowly becomes political betrayal. Reality gives way to mythology. The Dolchstoßlegende, the so-called stab-in-the-back legend, is born, and Adolf Hitler seizes upon it. He doesn't invent the technique. The ancient Romans clearly understood it. I said that, divide et impera, divide and conquer. But Hitler understood how extraordinarily powerful that political technology could become. Convince a nation that it wasn't defeated, but betrayed. And suddenly, your political opponents become something far more sinister than people who simply disagree with you. They become enemies, traitors, the people responsible for everything that's gone wrong. Now, fast forward about a century. Donald Trump's former wife, Ivana, tells us that Donald Trump kept a book of Hitler's speeches somewhere in his bedside. I don't know whether he read every speech. I don't know which speeches he read. I don't know what, if any, lessons he drew from them, and neither do you. But I think one inference is entirely reasonable. If a man keeps a book of Adolf Hitler's speeches by his bedside, it's probably because he intends to read them. And if he reads them, it is probably because he hopes to learn something from them. The argument could quite reasonably be made that that was the very last thing that he looked at before he went to sleep at night. Now, that's something. Perhaps one clue is after that, after the First World Wars, Hitler worked for German military intelligence. And yesterday, I realized, as I said, German military intelligence sounds almost like an oxymoron, but bear with me. Whether he learned these techniques there or somewhere else, by the time he entered politics, he clearly understood how political movements are built. And there's some evidence that one of his jobs was to be seated, as I said, into crowds at political rallies. There's even a photograph of him standing in one crowd that I'm aware of. He understood propaganda. He understood repetition. He understood grievance. He understood division. And perhaps more importantly, he understood the extraordinary political power that comes from persuading millions of people that their greatest enemies are not foreign armies, but their own fellow citizens. Think about that. Not emotionally, but analytically. How often have we heard the phrase, the enemy within? How often have we heard that America has been betrayed? How often have we heard that the real danger isn't merely foreign adversaries, but Americans themselves, the deep state, the fake news, disloyal Republicans, radical Democrats, the bureaucracy, the judges, the universities, the election officials, the immigrants? Stop. Stop right there. Am I saying that Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler? No, I am not. That is not my argument. My argument is that the political technique is strikingly similar. The appeal is not merely to disagreement, it is an appeal to betrayal. It says the nation has not simply encountered problems, it has been sabotaged from within. This is why you get the radicalness of MAGA. That is a very old political technology. Hitler didn't invent it, but judging from history, he applied it extraordinarily well. And when I learned that Donald Trump reportedly kept Hitler's speeches by his bedside, I couldn't help but ask myself two very simple questions. Number one, is it really unreasonable to think that he studied them? I don't think it is. And if he studied them, is it unreasonable to think he learned something from them? I don't think that's an unreasonable question to ask either. History doesn't merely tell us what happened. History teaches us, and if we fail to recognize those techniques when they appear, then history has very little left to teach us. And that is Politics by Jake.
This is Politics by Jake.